Got questions about the Brazos, no more unknowns. Ever wonder where that water comes from or where it goes? We're unpacking the Brazos River.
Welcome to the BRA's podcast, Unpacking the Brazos River. I'm Charlie Shugart, and I'm with our Public Information Office. Part of my job involves chatting on the phone with people all across the Brazos River Basin, and it's always an adventure with the sheer range of questions I field. What I often bump into, though, is it's clear some people out there are still a little fuzzy on exactly what it is we do. So today we're going to decode the drop, so to speak. So joining me today is Matt Phillips, the Brazos River Authority's Deputy General Manager and all-around all-star. Thanks for joining me today, Matt.
Thank you for having me.
So this is the first time our listeners are meeting you. So tell us a little bit about your history with the BRA.
I've been with the Brazos River Authority for about 15 years, most recently. Another stint before that for about 5 years. I was recently promoted to Deputy General Manager in 2024.
Congratulations.
October of 2024. Thank you. And before that, I was BRA's Legislative and Governmental Affairs Manager, which I did for all the rest of my time here. So that involves all of our interactions with the legislature and the federal government and policy and all those things. So I have a long history with BRA. In fact, I worked for BRA as a part-time maintenance worker when I was in high school at our Lake Limestone location.
That's amazing.
BRA has been part of my life for most of my life. So it's a great place to work, and I've always enjoyed being here and what we do.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us. So let's dive in a little bit. Who created the Brazos River Authority and why did they do it?
So the Brazos River Authority was created by the Texas legislature through the passage of what at that time was called old session laws. We've since been codified into the statute, but back then it was old session laws. And I think initially the BRA was created because there was massive flooding along the Brazos in the upper and central. There was just a ton of devastating flooding, particularly in and around the city of Waco. I know that there was a lot around then too. And so I think they were created to try to deal with that. And over time, our mission changed a little bit from that to more water supply. The federal government through the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers took over the flood control aspect in our basin. They manage flood control in our basin, whereas the BRA switched more to water supply. And that's led us more to the mission that we have now, which is to provide raw water and develop water and protect the water that we have in our reservoirs and in the Brazos River and its tributaries.
Speak a little bit more about what it means to develop, manage, and protect the water resources.
It's funny, over time those words change just as culture and society changes. At one point, oddly enough, the word conservation meant building a reservoir. It meant building a dam and holding back water during times of plenty and then using it during times of drought. Obviously now conservation has a completely different thing, but I think the same thing kind of happens with our mission is that over time as things change, it almost morphs. It uses the same words, but what those words mean can kind of change a little bit. I think develop for us in terms of where we are today in time and space means the development of new water supplies. We've got tremendous growth in our basin in our entire state, and our current supplies are only going to take us so far. So we're to the point where we've got to look to the development of new supplies, and that can take a number of different forms, whether that's new reservoirs like the one that we're working on Allen's Creek, or whether that's aquifer storage and recovery, or eventually maybe desalination along the coast. So that to me is the develop part. Manage is really kind of what our water services guys and our guys at the reservoirs do every day, and that's managing those supplies, the ones we have in our reservoirs, making releases, working on our infrastructure and our dams and making sure that they can continue to function and hold back water and do the things that they need to do, working at our water treatment plant in East Williamson County and making sure that it continues to function and expanding it. So that to me is the management part. It's those supplies that we currently have on the ground today, doing what we need to do to maintain those and make sure that they're still there.
A lot of different aspects to it.
Yeah, a ton of different aspects to that. And then to me, the protect part really gets into the environmental stewardship that we do and the environmental monitoring and making sure that we don't have impairments throughout our basin. I mean, really, we say it all the time, the cheapest, most accessible water supply you have is the one that you already have. Obviously, we're always working to develop new supplies, but we can't let anything from the standpoint of development or discharges or just environmental hazards cause a problem with the current supplies that we have, because we obviously already need more. The last thing we need is to have what we're currently counting on become a problem from an environmental standpoint.
You mentioned earlier raw water, and I don't think that's a term that maybe your day-to-day people are familiar with. So what do you mean when you say raw water?
It's untreated, so it doesn't go through a treatment plant. It hasn't been, treated to TCEQ drinking water standards, so it's not what you're going to see coming out of your tap. It is raw lake water, raw river water. It is what you see when you look at a lake or a river. Zooming out a little bit, we have a system of 11 reservoirs that we call our water supply system. 8 of them are owned and operated by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So those are owned by the federal government. It's their staff there at the dams. They're the one that make the releases. 3 of them are owned and operated by the Brazos River Authority and were built and constructed by us. And those are Possum Kingdom, Lake Limestone, and Lake Granbury. The difference between our reservoirs and core reservoirs is really that flood control aspect. Brazos River Authority reservoirs are purely for water supply, meaning when Mother Nature allows, we will keep them as full as we possibly can, but that's as full as they get. And once we start getting flood events, we have to pass in water that's coming out. Whereas you contrast that with the Corps of Engineer reservoirs like the other 8 that are in our system, and those have massive amounts of empty space or room at the top of them where they can catch additional water beyond their full pool in order to protect areas downstream.
Is there a reason why we can't just make ours flood control reservoirs now?
It would be next to impossible. You would not only have to somehow acquire all of the property around it, almost all of which is privately owned at our reservoirs, but you would also then have to restructure the dams themselves in order to be able to hold additional water. And so from that standpoint, it would be massively cost prohibitive. Additionally, our system is designed in such a way, particularly on the main stem of the Brazos, that while Possum Kingdom has to pass inflows and Granbury has to pass inflows, downstream of that, we have Lake Whitney. And Lake Whitney has a massive flood pool. Its flood pool is probably large enough to hold 2 Possum Kingdoms and 2 Granbury.
Oh, that's huge. Just the flood pool, not the whole lake.
Just the flood pool, not the whole lake. And so it is meant to be able to catch those flows that we're sending down from PK and Granbury during flood events.
So you talked a little bit about how we work to provide water. What does that look like? How exactly is it that we do that?
So we have about 150 long-term contracts totaling about 700,000 acre feet. And we can talk about acre feet and kind of what that means, because that's not usually a common term. It's a big old chunk of water. Probably is. But we provide water to our customers on a long-term basis, usually 30 years, via our contracts. In terms of how our customers take water, there's a couple of different ways they do it. We have some customers that take water directly from a lake. So directly from a reservoir, they have an intake station or a pump that pulls water out, and then it diverts it into their treatment systems where they treat it and then distribute it through whichever way they want to. We also have customers that take water from the river itself. So they will have an intake structure on the river, and they take water from the river as it's flowing by. The difference between the two is for the customers that take water from the river, depending on flow levels, they typically can require us to release water from upstream reservoirs in order for them to be able to have the right flow to take water.
So if somebody is in the lower part of the basin and they need access to more water, they'll call us and be like, hey, open the gates.
It depends on the conditions, because typically if we're in normal to wet conditions, there's enough river flow for them to be able to take water as they need to. But it's when we get into dry conditions that we have to start using the reservoirs for the purpose that they were built, which is they caught all that water when it was wet. Now it's dry. Folks need to be able to take water. So in that case, yes, they would reach out to us. We would begin releases from our reservoirs, particularly for the lowest downstream customers. The way that we do our releases is we start at our lowest available reservoir, and then we stair step up, because you always want to keep as much water as you possibly can from a water supply standpoint in your furthest upstream reservoir, which for us is Possum Kingdom, because it from a hydrological standpoint, it has less chance of catching as much rain as the other ones, and it's kind of the linchpin of your entire reservoir system. It's one of the largest ones in our system for us to be able to make water available to customers. So you never want to start with that one and then be using the lower ones later. And there's also a timing aspect, because the lower reservoirs can get water to those customers faster because they're closer to them. So we typically start at the lower reservoirs and then stair step our way up, because we want to keep as much water in our upstream reservoirs, particularly because we don't know when the drought's going to end.
Right.
So we don't know how long we're going to need to be making releases.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned that we have reservoirs within the BRA's system of reservoirs that are owned by us and owned by the Corps of Engineer. All the water within the Corps' lakes, is that part of our water supply system?
It is.
Okay.
I mean, backing up a little bit. So in order to be able to utilize water and surface water in Texas, which is a distinction between surface water and groundwater, and that's maybe a time for another subject for another podcast. To be able to utilize surface water in the state of Texas, you have to have what's called a water right from the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. And so the Brazos River Authority has been granted water rights by the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. And part of those rights involves storage. And we store a large amount of our water rights, I forget what the exact percentage is, in the 8 Corps of Engineer reservoirs that are in our system. Now, we have agreements with the Corps of Engineers to store our water there. And we also compensate the Corps of Engineers for storing our water there. That number varies and it's a different number each year, but it's to help pay for the operations and maintenance of those facilities because they're allowing us to store water in there.
Does that mean we don't just own all the water in the Brazos River Basin?
We do not. We do not, and we also don't hold all the water rights in the Brazos Basin. Now, we do hold a majority, if not most of the storage in the Brazos Basin just because of the 11 reservoirs that are in our system. But there are other cities and industries and electric producers and agriculture users that have their own water rights separate and apart from us.
I know a lot of people, because we have our central office located here in Waco, think that we own and operate Lake Waco as well. But this would be a good example of a different water right.
Correct.
Yeah.
The city of Waco holds the water rights in Lake Waco, and the Corps of Engineers owns and operates that reservoir. So we do not consider in any way Lake Waco to be part of our water supply system. It doesn't show up on any of our graphics that show our water supply system because it is completely solely controlled by the city of Waco.
So lakes aren't the only thing that we own and operate and in ways that we handle water.
We own and operate one water treatment facility, and it's located next to Lake Granger near the city of Taylor. And then we call it our East Williamson County Regional Water Treatment System. And it provides treated water. So that's different than raw water. It's water that's been treated to drinking water standards to the cities of Taylor, Jonah Special Utility District, and Lone Star Regional Water Authority. Those are our 3 main customers out of that plant. The interesting thing about that facility is it is in an unbelievably high growth area of our basin, which we have several high growth areas, but it's probably one of the highest growth areas of our basin. And so what started out as a little bitty old water plant is going to have to be expanded immensely over the course of the next 20 to 30 years in order to keep up with demand and allow us to be able to deliver additional treated water. I think that right now we're able to produce somewhere around 17 million gallons a day out of the East Williamson County facility. We are in the process of an expansion that I believe will take us to 27 million gallons a day. And then projections tell us we're going to need to get to 40 million gallons a day by the year 2040, which seems far off, but in water years, it's really not. We'll be there before you know it. So it is an area of high activity and high growth for us and high emphasis in terms of our work there to get that done.
So when we talk about increased populations, not just in Williamson County, but across the state and the basin, you talked a little bit about how we need to develop new water supply. How do you develop new water?
Oh, there's a lot of different ways and everybody's looking at all the different ways. And it's really important to remember for any basin or even for the state, there's not going to be any one solution. It's going to take a multitude of different water supply strategies to get us there. Conservation will be one of them. Folks will have to develop the ability and start using water differently. And I think what will drive that is the cost of water is going to go up, especially as we implement some of these other bigger water supply strategies. Some of the other strategies include reservoirs. We are in the process of permitting a reservoir that we're going to build in our lower basin called Allen's Creek. And maybe we'll have a whole podcast just on Allen's Creek at some point.
Definitely.
Very possible. We are looking at doing aquifer storage and recovery at our East Williamson County plant. It's actually part of the expansion, and that's the process by which you take excess surface water when you have it, you treat it, and we have the treatment plant right there, so we have the ability to do it. So we got the lake there, we got the treatment plant there, so that's 2 of the things we need. We treat it right there, and then you inject it down into the ground, and you build a bubble of water that you can then access later, particularly when you're in drought times and your reservoirs are struggling. You've built up that bank or that reserve. So aquifer storage and recovery is one of the strategies that a lot of folks are looking at. Another one that we're looking at is reallocation of water in one of our existing reservoirs. And when I say one of ours, it's one of the ones in our system, but it's actually owned and operated by the Corps of Engineers, and that's at Lake Whitney. So Lake Whitney has a large amount of water in it that has not been allocated to water supply. And
What do you mean exactly that it hasn't been allocated to water supply? It's just like,
it's just kind of what we believe to be extra
yeah,
water.
okay.
So Lake Whitney has 3 functions. So a lot of core reservoirs just have 2, flood control and water supply. Lake Whitney has 3. So it's got flood control, water supply, and it also produces hydroelectric power. Since Lake Whitney was built, there has been a large amount of water, hundreds of thousands of acre feet, that have just been held in reserve for hydropower production. So that one is a really important one for us, mainly because if you're able to reallocate water within an existing reservoir, the infrastructure is already there. You know, Lake Whitney has the ability to be a game changer for our basin because so many of the other projects that we work on take years to put in place because of all of the infrastructure you've got to build, the permitting that you have to do. Lake Whitney has the ability to make a large amount of water available in the short term. So potentially within the next 3 to 5 years. And that's light speed when you're talking about developing water supply. And it has the ability to do that without having major negative impacts on the other uses of the reservoir. So flood control, hydropower. It also won't have any negative effects on recreation at the lake. So life at the lake in terms of lakeside living and lakeside businesses and recreation will be the same after reallocation as it is now. And the other major thing is the additional water supply created by Whitney will benefit all of the areas around the lake that need water, the local area, the region, and other areas of the basin.
right.
And infrastructure with water is the expensive part. But in this case, the dam's already there, the water's already there. It's more of a modeling exercise and a study, which tells you the water's available. And then we've got to go to TCEQ and get a water right. But that to us is a huge deal for us if we could get additional water at Lake Whitney. You know, some of the other ways that people are looking to develop water is groundwater. Groundwater's so much different than surface water in terms of how it's regulated. And again, you could have a whole separate podcast on that, but you may want to bring in, groundwater experts because we're surface water people. But groundwater isn't governed by the state. It's a private property right. But there is a lot of interest from, cities and water districts and entities throughout our basin in developing and transporting groundwater. And that's where it becomes controversial because the area where you want to take the groundwater from never wants to see it leave. And
Now,
so
do we have a role in groundwater?
we do not, other than the fact that we plan to do aquifer storage and recovery and utilize Trinity Aquifer groundwater at our East Williamson County facility, which is property that we own right there in Williamson County. Other than that, we've explored the possibility of developing groundwater in the past. To us, it's really rife with litigation and controversy and issues with should you be able to transport it. And the regulatory framework surrounding groundwater has always been really tricky for us, which is part of the reason that we've never jumped off into developing it as one of our main supplies. Now, that doesn't stop others from doing it. And there are others all throughout Central Texas that are looking to develop groundwater. So that's one of the ways. And then I think, or that's one of the strategies that folks are looking at. And then I think another one is ultimately desalination. Everybody always points to that. Hey, we've got, this huge ocean of water literally right next to Texas. Why aren't we desalinating water? And the city of Corpus Christi is in the process of, finalizing a plant to do that.
And just briefly explain to people who don't know what desalination is, what that means.
It's where you take salty water and you run it through a massive filter at a high amount of energy to try to remove all the salt out of it and turn it into drinking water. It is expensive water because of that very process. It demands a high level of energy to be able to remove salt from water. And then you have to figure out what to do with the brine that's left over, which is always an issue because there's environmental issues associated with it. And desalinating water has always been considered an unbelievably expensive proposition. I think as we get further into the future, the costs of it are going down or becoming more reasonable. And that may be a function of the cost actually becoming more reasonable or our current water prices going up so much that they start to meet. And then it looks more and more reasonable, the fact that those deltas are starting to hit each other. But I do think, for the Brazos specifically, if you ever get to a point where desalination monies and makes financial sense, it could very well be a game changer for our basin. Because right now, we have all of this water in these upstream reservoirs that we at times release to the lower part of our basin. But if enough users in the lower part of our basin were able, from a financial standpoint, to convert to desalinated water, which right now there's not a ton of incentive for them to do it because their current water is pretty cheap. And that water is expensive. But if those numbers start to get closer together, then it allows you to reallocate water upstream that you're currently sending downstream, and it really does change the math in terms of water in our basin.
When a drought does hit, it can last, we never know how long it's going to last. And the amount of water that's left in these reservoirs is so important to manage adequately to ensure everyone has got the water that they need.
Yeah, and droughts are interesting because of what you've said. You never know when they're going to start, and you never know when they're going to end. They're really difficult to plan for. They're really difficult to manage through, particularly the really long ones. And it's funny from a public perception standpoint in terms of what they do to the reservoirs. They're just ugly. I mean, they are. The lakes get really low and everybody hates the way they look, and, you can't recreate as much, you can't use them as much. And, it's just a matter of differing perspectives. We see the same thing, and we see the reservoir doing its job. It caught water when it was wet, and now it's being used when it's dry. Thank God we had the reservoir there to catch that water when it was wet, because now we have something to use. If you were just relying on river flow, I don't think any of us would be here right now. You have to have those reservoirs to do that. Additionally, when lakes are really low, from, an aesthetic standpoint, it looks terrible. But from a hydrological standpoint, our guys would sit there and tell you, oh, there's 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 years worth of water still left in there. That's how they see it, because they're looking at it from a very different perspective, what its real use is versus what its benefits are.
Absolutely. So when we talk about customers and the people who are using it, who are we talking about? Who's using the water?
So our customers are a mix of municipalities, industrial users, electric producers, and agricultural users. So that's really kind of the 4 main categories. In terms of municipal users, our largest municipal user is Bell County Water Control and Improvement District number 1, which is located in Bell County. But then we have other major users in the I-35 corridor, such as the city of Georgetown, the city of Round Rock, city of Taylor. So those are some of our major users there. So got a lot of municipalities. Industrial users, think Dow Chemical. And we have another user named Gulf Coast Water Authority, and they are a multi-user. They have some municipal use, some industrial use, and some agriculture use, but they actually provide most, if not all, of the water to the whole Texas City refinery area. I think Marathon Oil. So a huge economic driver for our state gets water through there. Electric producers, you're talking TXU or Luminant and NRG. Those are 2 of the largest ones. And then the ag folks, just a variety of them. Agriculture is a much smaller segment of our customer base. I think it's under 4%. There is mining, but it's really even smaller. Mining to us is sand and gravel mining and those kind of things. We have much less of that than we have of the other uses.
Every year, our hydrologists compile data from the previous calendar year and release how much water is used, by whom, and where, among other details. It's called the Customer Water Use and Reservoir Accounting Summary Details. So if you love data, you can get on there and look at the amount of inflows into each reservoir, how much water was released for water supply, how much water was used by lakeside users. I mean, even how much water was just lost to evaporation. That's how detailed it is, that everybody looks at the water supply that's in the basin and truly manage it is like down to these numbers for everyone. I'll give you an example. In 2024, 300,973 acre feet of water was used all across the basin.
To put that into perspective, we've had some pretty high use years at times, particularly in droughts, right? But we have water rights totaling around 700,000 acre feet. And I think even in our highest use year, driest, the 2011 through 2015 drought, I think we just touched around 400,000 acre feet. So that tells you how much water we still have in terms of, I want to say extra very carefully. I don't mean in terms of extra, but just in terms of not being up against our max capacity. Now that's going to change as population growth and all of the growth we're seeing throughout the basin. But, we're still in a pretty good spot from that perspective, that even in the driest of dry years, we're still just over half in terms, and in a normal to wet year, we're closer to 250 to 300,000 in terms of usage.
You talked a little bit earlier about the environmental work that is done. Can you touch a little bit about exactly what our role is in that?
Our folks do a massive amount of sampling and water quality monitoring throughout our basin. We are the Clean Rivers representative for the state of Texas, and that's something that we work on in coordination with, and for the Brazos Basin, and that's something we work on in coordination with TCEQ. So we have monitoring stations or monitoring sites all throughout the Brazos Basin and its tributaries. And what we do is we go take water samples, and they do species counts. They look at what type of flora and fauna are growing in a particular segment.
What type of what?
Flora and fauna. Don't ask me to explain it. What type of critters.
Okay.
Let's just say that. what type of critters are present in a certain area, because knowing what type of critters are present in a certain area can tell you what the water quality is like. And so they're doing all of these assessments. A lot of those they bring back to our lab. They're tested. They're sent to TCEQ. And what we're looking for is, one, to just understand the quality of those segments, but two, to see if there are trends, to see if we're starting to see downward trends, to see if we're moving towards impairments in our water bodies. And I mentioned it earlier, protecting our water supplies, making sure that it's of good quality, that we can supply it to folks. Well, the last thing in the world we need is for some segment of our basin to have a water quality problem such that it becomes not usable or something that we can't provide to our customers, because then that's water off the table. A ton of their work goes toward that. We have a NELAP accredited lab, which, to me just means that the data that we produce in our lab can be held up in a court of law. So it's legit. That's what I usually like to say.
And NELAP is the National Environmental Laboratory Accreditation Program.
I'm glad you knew that, because I did not. I just always use the words NELAP. They do an outstanding job. If you ever drive by and you see guys in waders out there with, nets and things like that, it's our folks out there, looking and trying to protect the quality of our water.
Whether it's 100+ degrees or...
Doesn't matter. They go out there no matter what the conditions are like. Sometimes I think I might envy their job until I think about it being freezing cold and going out there and doing that. And then I'm a hard pass. I'm a hard pass on that.
There's another aspect of our operations I feel like a lot of people aren't aware of, and that is our involvement in wastewater treatments.
So I think the BRA got involved in wastewater treatment maybe back in the 60s or 70s. And I think it came from the perspective of almost, again, back to that protect idea that, wastewater treatment plants are going to be discharging into waters in our basin, whether it's the tributaries or the Brazos itself.
And I don't think a lot of people realize that's what happens.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's got to go somewhere. And there are some facilities that land apply. It is a thing that you can do, but for the most part, they end up discharging back into a stream or river segment. And the water that's discharged, if it's done properly, is cleaner than the water it's going into. Okay, and TCEQ permits those, and their job is to make sure that that's actually what's happening. And that's also part of what goes into our environmental monitoring, is looking at, discharge sites or sites downstream of those.
So it's much less of a ick factor than I feel like when people hear it for the first time.
Way less of an ick factor. I think folks sometimes have the preconceived notion that it's the same coming out as it was going in. Oh my God, it shouldn't. No, it gets treated to an extremely high standard. So I think that was the reason that we got involved. And over time, we've continued that process. All of the wastewater treatment plants where we work, we are an operator, meaning we don't own those facilities. So a city, for the most part, in most cases, such as cities of Temple and Belton, or city of Sugar Land, or city of Clute, they actually own the facilities. They are theirs. So we are there as a contract operator, and we bring our expertise, our outstanding employees. The guys that work on our treatment side are great, and we operate those facilities for them and make sure they stay in accordance with TCEQ standards and are doing their job. So to us, it makes a lot of sense, just because there's a way in which we're helping protect water quality by being the operators of those facilities.
Can you talk a little bit about how exactly we're funded?
So we are funded primarily through the sale of water and the other services we provide, like our contract water and wastewater operations. So we do not receive tax dollars. We do not have the ability to tax. We do not receive appropriations from the state. So the state does not give us money for our budget. So we are what's considered entirely a self-funded entity. So all of the water that we sell on a contract basis, we sell for a system rate, with the exception of some older contracts that haven't quite yet converted to the system rate. And the revenue that we generate from selling that water and providing those other services goes into our continual maintenance and upkeep of our dams and facilities, which is a huge part of what we do. Some of our dams, our newest dam was built in 1974. These facilities are old. They're going to have to be maintained. So a lot of it goes into that. A lot of it goes into just our general operations and our staff and what it takes to run all of these facilities. And then a lot of it, as we're moving forward, is going to go into developing these new supplies that we're working on.
So you mentioned a system rate. What does that mean?
So the system rate is a rate that's set by our board every year that dictates the cost of our water for our system customers, those that buy water under our what we call a system water availability agreement. That system rate is adjusted each year by our board. It generally goes up each year by 5 to 6 to 7%. And the way that we explain that is the cost of water is never going to go down. It's always going to go up. The cost of everything that we're doing increases every year in terms of maintaining our facilities and developing new supplies and all of that. So it is the rate that we charge our system customers for water. It gets a little bit more complicated when you try to explain the difference between a system customer and a non-system customer. The BRA moved to a system rate years and years ago. I think it was in the late 90s that the BRA began to convert everyone to the same rate. So anyone that buys water from us pays the same rate. When they did that, there were some old what we call legacy contracts that were contracts currently in existence. Those are not currently at the system rate. Now our board has made a policy decision that as older non-system contracts expire, they will be converted to a system rate under the system contract. And so everyone that buys water from us eventually under the system rate will pay the same rate. We'll all pay into the system, and then that system funds everything that we do.
So someone couldn't come in and say, I'm going to offer you 10 times the amount of cost of what someone else is paying you for water so I can have access to water.
No, we don't auction off our water. It's not the way that we make it available. We will make water available at the system rate when we have it to anyone who is able to use it for a beneficial purpose.
How do we determine who gets the water? Like, who can be customers?
Well, right now we have to have some water to sell to be able to do that.
Oh,
And right
okay.
now,
Yeah, I guess that would be important.
right now we don't. In terms of the 700,000 acre feet approximately that we have rights to, we're pretty much fully contracted out. We don't have any additional long-term water to make available right now. But when we develop our next source of supply, whether that's Allen's Creek or Whitney reallocation or something else, we do have a waiting list for water where folks have reached out to us saying, when you develop additional water, I want to be on the list of the folks that you talk to. So when we do have an additional supply available, we'll reach out to the folks on that list and see if what we have for them is still accurate, and then go from there in terms of what we can actually make available. So in terms of how we would make water available, it would follow kind of that process. Whatever next source we look at, whatever next source we develop, we're then going to look to that list. We also try to provide water in accordance with the state and regional water plan. So we like to have customers whose needs are recognized in the state and regional water plan, which is a whole nother process that I brought up that we're probably going to need to talk about.
Just briefly explain what that is.
So the state has a process to plan for future water demands and sources where they broke the state up into 16 regions. Each region looks at every individual what's called WUG, or water user group,
WUG.
which is a water user. They look at its population projections and are they going to need additional water and what's going to supply it. And so that's probably the simplest way that I can go through it without getting into way more detail than we want to. And then each of those 16 regional water plans is submitted to the Water Development Board, and they use that to build the state water plan, and they do it every 5 years. And it's really kind of looked at as, okay, the roadmap for how we're going to meet our water needs in the future. From a very simple standpoint, it looks at population projections, water demands, potential water shortages. How do you fill those gaps? What are going to be the supplies to do that? But we like to provide water in accordance with the state and regional water planning process because we support that process, and it is kind of the roadmap for how we're supposed to do it. So we would look to our waiting list. We would look to the state water plan. Given the demands that we have in our basin, it is impossible that any one of our next sources is going to meet all of them. There's just no way. It's going to take multiple sources, and they're not all going to come online at the same time because that's just not how water works. So typically what we've done is, we look at the requests that we have from folks, and we tend to prorate it across the board. So everyone gets some of what they've asked for. Not everyone gets all of what they've asked for. And we say, once we develop our next source, we'll come back and we'll try to fulfill the rest of that need.
You talked a little bit about the difference between the amount of water rights that we have permitted versus the amount that we use. So what's in between, that's not available to other people then?
No, because it's under contract.
To somebody else?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, and that's really something that folks, I don't know, understand. Some entities, particularly cities, contract for water in excess of what they need right now so that they can grow into it.
Well, buffer space.
It's buffer space. It's for their growth. They know that they're going to grow, and eventually they're going to be using that water, but they're not using it right now. But because they have it under contract, it is not available to someone else. Now, we do allow our customers to do water resale agreements. Part of the reason we do that is we know that we can't always meet a need, but we do allow our customers to resell their water to someone else. And that is a transaction that we have no involvement in. Whatever price they negotiated it's an arm's length transaction. All we do is sign off on, okay, yes, you can do the resale agreement. That's our only involvement in that. It is a good way to meet a short-term need. We don't allow resale agreements to last for a really long time, because the last thing that we want is for some entity that is buying water from one of our customers to become dependent on that water, and then our customer now need it and need to use it, and then they're stuck without any water. So we always look at those as short-term solutions, not necessarily long-term solutions.
So we're not selling water on a day-to-day basis.
Yes, our contracts are 30 years typically, and they can go a little bit longer, just depending.
And now, could you tell me a little bit about the policy-making arm of the BRA?
The overarching policy-making arm of the BRA rests with our 21-member board of directors, who are appointed by the governor. So they set the broad policies of the BRA in terms of how we budget and how we function and how we, handle a lot of the day-to-day business, but they set it at a very broad level in terms of our policies and procedures and their bylaws and things like that. So that's really the policy-making arm of the BRA, whereas the day-to-day operations are left to the general manager and then the staff that the general manager employs.
So these board positions, are these paid positions?
No. They are volunteer positions, as are most, if not all, river authority boards. People do it because they want to serve, and they see an opportunity to be involved with something that's a really big deal in our state, and that's trying to supply water to Texas.
So the meetings that they hold, is this something the public can come to and listen or ask questions?
Absolutely. So the public is welcome to attend any of our meetings. We usually meet the last Monday every other month starting in January. We do adjust that for certain holidays like Memorial Day and Thanksgiving, so we'll bump them up or back. In addition, and we were kind of an early adopter of this, we live stream our meetings on YouTube, so people can tune in from their home and watch our meetings. Now, obviously, in those, they can't necessarily interact. They need to be here in the building to be able to interact or address the board. But, I would say we're one of the few that adopted that many, many years ago so that people could at least watch, the board meetings live and keep track of our activities.
I don't think a lot of people realize that the basin is as big as it is.
Oh, yeah.
So with it stretching from the Texas-New Mexico border all the way down to the Gulf, the reach and the impact that operations and the things that we do have affect a lot of people who maybe can't just drive up to Waco for a meeting.
Right.
So we do a lot of different work with a lot of different projects, a lot of different locations. So through all of that, who are we accountable to?
Oh, man, it's a good one. I like that one. So let's go through it in terms of levels. As a public entity, we are accountable to the public. We interact with the public. The public uses our reservoirs, and we're subject to open meetings and open records and all the things that any public entity is subject to. So we see ourselves as absolutely accountable to the public because we are a public governmental entity, and that's how you should view it from a transparency standpoint. It's part of the reason that we started live streaming our board meetings years ago. We wanted folks to be able to see what we were doing. We're not hiding anything. You don't have to come to Waco to see it. Here you go. Take a look. It's right here on YouTube. We are accountable to the legislature. The legislature created us. So they have the ability at any given time to change statute and change how we can do things. Everything we can and can't do is dictated somewhere in the law. And so they have the ability to change it. We're obviously accountable to our board. Our board is the main policy-making arm of our organization. They are appointed by the governor and approved by the Senate. So we're absolutely accountable to them. We're accountable to the regulatory agencies that have oversight of our operations. So think TCEQ, in some instances, EPA.
That's the Environmental Protection Agency.
Environmental Protection Agency. So we have to be accountable to them. We have to report to them. We are accountable to an arm of TCEQ, and this may elicit a whole nother subject of questions, which is called the Brazos River Water Master, which is essentially a regulatory framework within TCEQ specific to the Brazos Basin that ensures that water right holders are taking water at the time and sequence that they're supposed to in terms of the seniority of their water right, so that nobody's taking their water out of place.
So holding people accountable.
Correct. To make sure they're taking water when they're supposed to. We're obviously accountable to our customers, which to us is a big one. Our customers are who fund our operations, and we want to use and spend and be accountable for the funds they entrust us with wisely. We want to make sure that we're doing a good job with the money that they give us because we will use those funds in beneficial ways to benefit our customers by developing additional water supplies. So those are probably the main levels that I can think of. I'm sure there may be more.
A lot of different areas.
A lot of different areas. Absolutely. And one of the things that we've always prided ourselves on is transparency. A lot of government entities get hit all the time that, you're secretive and we don't know enough. My goodness, as far as BRA goes, there's very little about us that you can't find on our website. There's very little about us that you can't find on our social media. We put everything out there, and anything that you don't know, just ask us.
Why? Why do we make that a priority?
Because we should. I think that in order to interact with the public as you're doing your business, like like our regular lake operations or some of these major projects we're going to have to do, some of them are controversial. They're big deals. They're going to take up property. They're going to change areas in terms of what they look like. And, we're going to be doing things, and we may be moving water from place to place and things that people don't like. And you may not always be able to get folks to agree with what you're doing, but if you start with some level of trust that you're not trying to hide things, it really helps those discussions. And that's how we've always tried to look at it. It at least makes the playing field more honest and easy whenever they know that you're going to be an open, honest entity and answer any questions that they have and provide them with any data that they have. And, I think it's just always something that we've made a priority for our organization, as most should.
Overall, how would you say the BRA measures its effectiveness in carrying out its objectives?
That's a good one. Is everybody else going to get asked that one? That's what I want to know. To me, I'll go at that a couple of different ways. I'll go back to the transparency thing, and we always maintain ourselves as a transparent, open organization. That to me is effective. That is an important measurement of effectiveness. But from an operational standpoint, from a water supply standpoint, I think continually being able to deliver the water that we have promised contractually to our customers is a massive measure of our success. If there's ever a point where we can't do that, then we have failed. We have obviously done something wrong by either not maintaining our facilities or not accounting for the way that we're supposed to account for water correctly in terms of how we contract for it. So continually being able to deliver the water that we've contracted to our customers. And I think as we move forward, we will measure some of our success by our ability to develop additional water supplies. I think it will become a measure of our success. Someone is going to have to do it. The BRA is uniquely situated to be able to do a lot of it. We can't do all of it. Let me be very clear about that. We can't develop every future water supply for the Brazos Basin. Folks are going to have to do some of it on their own. But I think our ability to develop and deliver additional water supplies as we move forward is going to be a massive measure of our success as an organization.
Is there anything else that you would like to add that we haven't touched on that?
The BRA is an outstanding organization to work for. I've been here for most of my professional life, if you could call me a professional, which is sometimes a stretch. And we own a lot of assets, dams and pipelines and all that kind of stuff. And we always say this, and it's true. And I think it's always worth repeating every time we do one of these, and anybody else who does these, if they get asked that question, maybe they'll say the same thing. The most important asset we have is our people. We try to hire and retain outstanding individuals. And all throughout our basin and all throughout our organization and in our central office, we have outstanding, dedicated employees who believe in our mission, who are dedicated to accomplishing that mission. And I think that will always be a focus of ours, is not just to have folks who are clocking in and clocking out, not just to have warm bodies in places, but people that, really believe in our organization and want to be part of something. And I think that's part of the reason that we keep people for as long as we do. We've got great retention just because we hire outstanding people. So the best asset we own besides the brick and mortar stuff is the people that work here. And probably obviously very much more important than the brick and mortar stuff.
And you really know that even in just the 6 years that I have been here, just the passion you see behind people who get excited about their jobs and
Yeah.
what they do and understand the importance behind it.
Yeah. I mean, we have people who wake up excited to come do water accounting, and I don't know how you could get excited for that. And
No numbers for me.
and modeling and things like that. I don't know how you get excited for it, but they do.
We appreciate people of all skill
And
types.
we are glad to have them.
All right. Well, there are a lot of ways to stay in touch with the projects, the work that the BRA is doing on. We have an email newsletter that goes out you can sign up for. We are on a bunch of social media sites: Facebook, X, Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube, Nextdoor. We'll answer your questions there along with your messages. And as Matt mentioned, you can attend our board meetings or watch them as they're live streamed. And if you just, wake up one morning with a question, you can always just email us. You can reach us at information@brazos.org, and we will help get you the information that you need. Matt? Thanks for sharing all your insight and knowledge.
Thank you for having me. I hope it was both insightful and I shared some knowledge.
I do. I feel like my internal hard drive is fuller and significantly more interesting. So if you've got a topic about the Brazos River, the BRA, water supply, or more that you'd like to hear more about, feel free to reach out to us. Again, our email is information@brazos.org. And with that, thanks for listening to Unpacking the Brazos River.